So today's lecture will be on sparkling wine. Some of you might be thinking, why am I not calling it champagne? Because isn't that the same thing? Well, yes and no. Product and the end product and the production methods, for the most part, are the same, but they are quite different in the fact that if you were going to call it champagne, then that sparkling, wonderful beverage must be made and must be produced in the Champagne region of France. If you're going to make it anywhere else, well, then you can call it sparkling wine, or you can call it cava if it's coming from Greece, or you can call it prosecco if it's coming from Italy. But you cannot call it from champagne unless it is coming from the Champagne region of France. Now, of course, that is for us to know who are in the industry, but to most people, it is quite the same. They associate sparkling wines and champagne with happy occasions, almost celebrations. Whenever somebody thinks of a champagne, they think of weddings, they think of New Year's. And those are all things that the industry has done. We have basically created this marketing campaign around champagne and sparkling wine to make it as such. So whether you're drinking Dom Perignon or Veuve Clicquot or J. Schramm, or you're drinking Corbel, which is not the highest quality, but people still associate a bubbly beverage with some sort of champagne. So let's talk about how it's actually made. So remember when we talked about production and wine production, we knew that a byproduct of fermentation was the release of CO2. So wouldn't you know it, if we stop this, or if at some point the winemaker decides, well, maybe I do want a sparkling wine, if they actually stop the escaping of CO2, they can actually figure out that they will have a sparkling wine. The first person on paper, I guess, that we know that potentially made this discovery was a monk called Perignon. And we know him by Dom Perignon because Dom means monk. And he is the one that we believe historically first wrote down the fact that something happened in the process. He was the head winemaker at his abbey, and he somehow possibly corked a bottle too soon, and it created bubbles. It ended up fermenting a little bit more in the bottle and had bubbles. And when he tested it out, and the other monks, they said, wow, this is pretty good. Maybe we should figure out how to make this. Now that abbey is still producing Dom Perignon today, and that is a very famous wine. It retails for around $100 and more. So it is definitely a nice tip that we got our sparkling wine beginnings from a monk. So we'll take that. Okay, so let's really quickly take a look at how wine turns into champagne or sparkling wine.
It's the stuff to serve them if you're out to impress. That extra special tipple for extra special occasions. Champagne is the king of sparkling wines. But transforming a humble bunch of grapes into something that can fetch $1,000 a bottle takes a good nose and some centuries-old winemaking wizardry. So, how do they do it? The name Champagne comes from the region in northeast France where it's made. White wine can be as bubbly and as tasty as it likes, but if it doesn't come from these 33,500 hectares of vineyards, it's not champagne. 245 million years ago, this was the floor of a prehistoric sea. Now the fossilized remains of millions of ancient sea creatures have turned to chalk, providing the perfect growing conditions for grapes, retaining just the right amount of water so the vines don't dry out. The soil is classified according to the quality of grapes it produces. The very best soil is classed as Grand Cru. When it comes to the finest champagne, these little things matter. Champagne can be made from just 3 principal varieties of grape: Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay. That's 2 varieties of red grape and 1 white. Of course, not everybody likes their champagne pink. But that's not a problem, because inside the dark grape skins is white juice. Sadly, nowadays, the grapes are not crushed by the delicate feet of lissom French maids, but in this shiny industrial press. The machine gently and quickly squashes the grapes so they don't take on the colour of the skins. That's the colour taken care of, but getting the taste right is a much bigger challenge. The Piper Heidsieck winery might be all spotless stainless steel today, but the method for making champagne goes back almost 300 years. The juice from different grape varieties and different villages, each with its own unique flavours, goes into individual stainless steel fermentation vats. They add yeast, which slowly reacts with the sugar in the grapes to produce alcohol. But fine champagne isn't the product of just one batch of grapes. It's a carefully crafted blend of flavours from different crus that produces a distinctive house champagne taste. Over the 6 months in the vats, when the wine is alcoholic but still flat, the super-sensitive noses get to work, choosing which crus to mix with what. Alexandra Rendell explains.
Throughout 6 months, they're going to be tasting every single wine. They have to select a certain number that together, in different proportions, needs to have exactly the same taste as the one the consumer today is tasting.
You might not be able to tell a Bollinger from a Budweiser, but these guys can tell you what colour socks the farmer was wearing. Delightful. Once the noses have made their choice, the various crus are mixed in exactly the right proportion. And the carefully blended cocktail is poured into 5 million bottles, and a little yeast and sugar added before the bottles are sealed. At the moment, this is just white wine. There are still no bubbles. And champagne without bubbles is like a wedding without a bride. But thanks to the yeast and sugar, a second fermentation is taking place inside the bottle. And because the bottle is sealed, the carbon dioxide can't escape. It's trapped as tiny bubbles. It takes about 3 weeks for the bubbles to form and the yeast to use up all the sugar. Then the yeast dies, but its job isn't quite finished. It's left inside the bottles for 2 years, and the sediment or lees gives the wine a complex, creamy, distinctly champagne flavour. These 18 kilometres of cellars are kept at a constant 12 degrees Celsius for this fermentation process. Once the lees have done their job, they've got to find a way to get them out without losing the sparkle. It's all in the wrist. Every day, a team of men known as the Riddlers perform a bizarre ritual. They delicately rotate 30,000 bottles 1/8 of a turn, gradually tipping it further and further upside down. This laborious process entices the lees into the neck of the bottle. After 3 weeks of being turned very slowly, the champagne bottles are carried upside down on a kilometre-long journey. It begins with a brine bath at -27 degrees Celsius. They're plunged in head first. The contents of the bottleneck promptly freeze, trapping the lees. Then they take off the crown cap, and the pressure from the fizzy carbon dioxide inside forces out the frozen lees, leaving behind crystal clear, bubbling champagne. But the bubbles that have taken 2 years to brew are escaping. So the bottles are swiftly corked and wired down to hold them in place.
So there you are. So that gives you an idea about the entire process and how sparkling wine champagne is made. And truly, the names and the labels that we recognize today, they are kind of paying an homage to people that had influence in the history of making of this. Veuve Clicquot, we already talked about Dom Perignon, now we're going to talk about Veuve Clicquot. Arguably, this is one of the most recognized labels when it comes to champagne. A lot of people call it just the orange label. Give us the orange label. That's even used in restaurants. And the reason that This label is famous is because it is named after Mrs. Clicquot, or Veuve Clicquot, which means widow. She literally was a widow, and she was a winemaker, a champagne maker, and she is the one that discovered Riedling, and basically she discovered these pallets that essentially, as you see these men turning them, they're kind of A-framed, and they hold the bottle kind of at this end, and what it does, it allows the kind of the sediment to collect in the neck of the bottle, and that's at the end leaving a clear beverage in the end. So it's really interesting. These are Riedlers that are actually there standing and turning. I actually worked at a sparkling wine production facility in Switzerland during one of my summers in college, and one day I spent Riedling, and I swear to God, I thought I was going to lose my hands. These guys do it for a living. I give them a lot of credit. Look at this beauty. This is Veuve Clicquot herself, and this is her Riedling, Riedling tables that she actually created. So let's kind of walk through the production of sparkling wine or champagne. So we actually are going to press, it's going to be made exactly the same way. So the initial thing is we're going to press our grapes. We'll talk about which ones they need to be in a little bit. And we're creating a dry white wine. We have a desired alcohol of 10.5 to 11. We want to keep it lower because we're actually it's going to increase based on we're going to have it go as a second fermentation in the bottle. And we need to make sure that we are creating a desired wine that we would want. So we don't want it to be too high in alcohol yet. And we want it to be just acidic enough so that we can add some sugar to it. So it's a very specific flavor that we're looking for. In any type of sparkling wine, especially champagne production, you can only use 3 grapes. Now, can you use other ones? Yes. But then once again, you cannot call it champagne, or you're not following the champagne procedures. But the 3 that are used are Chardonnay, Pinot Meunier, and Pinot Noir. Chardonnay is your white grape. Pinot Meunier and Pinot Noir are your reds. So we know that that's okay because we only use the juice from it. We are not going to be actually doing anything else to it. So whenever we're actually going to create this wine, we're going to ferment it, and then we're going to put it into a bottle, and we're going to cap it with a beer cap. But before we do that, we're going to put something else inside, and that's called a liqueur de tirage. And what that is, it's a mixture of sugar and yeast, and we're going to pop it in the bottle and then cap it with a beer, it looks like literally a beer cap, and we're going to let that sugar and the yeast start fermenting again, which we know is going to raise the alcohol level a little bit, but it's also going to create that CO2. And since we're going to trap it in the bottle, we're actually going to keep it right in there. Now, during this time, it will work, and this can literally, it starts kind of working in a couple of weeks. And if you have some wine that is not as high quality, that's probably how long it takes. So something like a Corbel or whatever it is, they are not keeping their wine to rest for much longer. Most champagne makers keep it for at least a year, some for 2 years, like Piper Heidsieck. Some, like Dom Perignon, they don't even touch any of their bottles for 7 years. So once again, you can start thinking about why those wines are so expensive, because they actually sit on their product for at least 7 years before they make any type of money off of it. So once we have it in there with that beer cap, we tip it just like Clicquot said we should do. Sometimes we have, some people that come and turn our bottles. Most wineries now, they have what are called gyro pallets, as you can see in the picture right here. And what they do, these are like automatic turns, and they actually turn it. So we have some machines helping us in the process. And finally, when we're looking at, degorging and the final part, and that's kind of the cool thing when they take the bottles and they flip them over and they freeze the contents of the neck of the bottle, and then they remove the beer cap. If the pressure inside the bottle spits out the leftover yeast and whatever it may be, and then they very quickly have to put the cork in and then thing. But they do one more thing before they put the cork in. And what they do is they pop in what's called dosage. Now, dosage is a small amount of sugar that you put in before you put that cork on, before you put the little cage over it. and that's actually what makes it either sweet or not sweet, and that's where it is. Here are just some types of wines that you guys might have, but basically that's it. So there's your quick overview of how to make sparkling wine and champagne.